So just going on from what we were talking about with EA and just seeing like the consistent themes that are coming through. You see the themes that are coming through sort of in the changing landscape, you know, the embedding of QA, sort of the QA automation, the live support, you know, it's all about like getting sort of QA acceptance, and it's also about providing that sort of career progression as well for sort of the people that are working in the business. So moving into that, also trying to keep it as wide as possible in the different disciplines that have to be integrated into now as well is localization is obviously a very key part going hand in hand with QA. I think also that that's changing sort of quite a lot sort of dependent upon how you look at sort of more like the console business to more like the live service business and the ongoing support of that. So on that note, I'd like to introduce Amy from VMC.
Great, thanks for joining us today. And my name is Amy Nanto. I'm the Client Solutions Executive at VMC Game Labs. We have a booth right outside, so feel free to come by, ask us any questions, and we can go into the details. So today at our panel, we'll be talking about localization QA. So as you all know, the localization process is definitely playing a huge part in the product development cycle to ensure a successful global launch and a good user experience as well. So today we'll be talking about some trends, some challenges that you might be facing, and also some key takeaways on how to achieve successful localization QA. So on our panel today, just want to do a quick introduction. We have some of our industry leaders with us. On my far left, I have Velasha Summers. She's the Senior QA Director at Konami. And I have Paul CHAVEZ. He is the Lead International Program Manager at Microsoft Studios. And then last but not least, Jeff Close. He is the Vice President of Software Development at Double Down Interactive and also part of IGT. Well, welcome and thank you.
Thank you.
So real quick, I just want to do a quick introduction and also ask, well, let me ask a quick question of the audience. Now we have more people coming in. How many of you are working specifically in the localization space? See some hands? Okay. How many of you are how about dealing with localization while working in games development, QA, or production? Great, perfect. Just want to get a sense of everybody. Good, so let's get started. Let us have our panel speakers give us a quick introduction and also let us know how they're related to localization as well.
Who first? I'll start. At Double Down, which was acquired by International Gaming Technology in January, I transitioned from heading the overall game development group to heading the mobile. So I'm now director of mobile technology at Double Down at IGT. We have an HTML5 based mobile product, which is on both iOS and Android. It's a native wrapper around HTML5 web app. We're just now moving into a position of localizing that, starting to do outreach for other non-US markets. We actually know from a lot of our user data that we have a substantial number of non-English speaking and non-US users. So in my current work, we're kind of just starting, and so I'm in the midst of sort of rethinking a lot of past experiences with localization. Prior to this, a lot of my experience was in MMOs, both browser-based and PC MMOs, and also in kind of traditional mobile. Worked for, years back, worked for Nokia for 3.5 years, developed some social networking community applications that were both embedded in phones and also had downloadable updates. And those were all localized into 39 languages. And so that would, complete global outreach. That was at a time when Nokia had 65% global market share. So that's pretty much, and then most of the MMO experience I have has also been through browser-based games that were localized.
Thank you. My name is Velasha Summers, and I actually started QA and localization about 18 years ago as a Brazilian-Portuguese localization for Disney. I have been, since then, worked at Disney. I worked at Vivendi Games. I had also my own QA testing company. And about 4 years ago, I was asked to be part of Konami and implement the QA team, where we QA for all kinds of platforms that's available on the market, and also localized, have a localization team, a part of the QA group.
I'm Paul CHAVEZ, work at Microsoft Studios. I've been at Microsoft for going on 9 years now. So started in the Office team, working on Office as a platform, Microsoft CRM as well. Then I realized I'm a gamer and I care more about gamers as well, so I moved into Microsoft Studios to work on games. I manage most of our new platforms, the games that we go on our new platforms. So think of Windows Phone, think of Windows 8, where we're doing double-digit number of languages. And previous to this, I was at Adobe for a couple years managing internet-based products. Thanks.
Very good. So I have a couple basic questions. What is localization, and why do you localize content?
So I brought a show and tell. So for me, this is a great example of localization. This is McDonald's tray sheet from Hong Kong. And it's hard to see, but it's green Thai curry burger, right? So for me, localization is this, right? You take your product, you make it work for your target markets. So I don't think this would really sell here in the States, especially the gooey curry. But you know, that's what we need to do with our products, whether it's a game or a software app. We need to make sure the content itself works for them, whether it's the humor or, of course, the standard UI, etc. But we need to adapt our content for target markets. You hungry?
I'm getting there. Actually, I was searching for some form of show and tell, so that's a good one. So actually, I have a small story to add on to that, which is that I was traveling in Thailand. I have a picture somewhere in photo album of a signboard outside a restaurant that had like all very Americanized, pictures of dishes like pizza and scrambled eggs and hamburger, and then fish head soup. So that was so that's an example of completely failed localization to American tourists. I would add to that, it's everything about transforming a product for a locale. It's not obviously not just the language translation, and it's not just the visuals. It's even rethinking the user experience, because there are things about the user experience that don't make sense to people in different cultures. There can be legal and commercial requirements in mobile. Obviously, for example, there are different ways of paying across the globe. There are different forms of use of credit card, mobile-based payments, and so on. And there can even be hardware. Hardware differences across cultures. So.
To me, is really take your content and cater for a specific region and nationality. Needless to say, I'm a foreigner, so to me, having that experience of, being in my country, visit and see, the games that we're doing here and how it's presented, in Brazil, and the way the language is really, translated and it relates to us. It's not just like, a bunch of words on the screen that was, there's no culturalization, slangs into it that kind of makes sense to us. We, something that you can look and say, oh, okay, yes, that was catered for us. I think that's the way for you to reach a broader audience, definitely.
I agree. The cultural piece is definitely very important. Now, on the games QA side, for localization as well, I say, so QA is definitely an inseparable part of the localization process as well. So in your point of view, why localization QA matters?
Go ahead.
For me. Well, so QA. Well, when you're putting your market to these new target regions, right? First, you need to make sure it works and it matches the needs of the market, right? So, for me, I worked in Japan for 7 years, so I have, I guess, that unique perspective, like you do, living and working here. You need to just make sure it works and it matches, whether it's making sure it'll pass for the age rating or geopolitical issues or, the easy answer is just to make money, right? You have to make sure you localize and QA it correctly, so you're making the right amount of money, or a lot of money. So that's kind of a short answer.
I would say additionally, to me, localization into different markets matters greatly, because obviously it's a way of expanding into a given market and increasing retention in some markets. But I would think more importantly, failed localization or lack of localization or neglecting localization is such a visible flaw in a piece of software or an application in an online experience compared to some other types of bugs. I mean, you can have other types of bugs in your application, and companies frequently do now online and Web 2.0, 3.0. But in many cases, those kinds of bugs are either not too noticeable or sometimes go undetected or something, or they're not enragers for your perceived audience. Whereas failed localization, at the very least, is usually very visible, and often can really be kind of an enrager for people because of the cultural differences. It's almost insulting, for a lot of people if they feel like you're delivering a product and you haven't even bothered to, modify the UI to address a given market, or to pay respect to their language. And obviously, and then in some cases, it's actually a legal requirement, like as it is in Canada with French, or France or other places.
I think the importance, adding to what you guys said, is also the same way a bad game, in 5 minutes, like, Marietta was mentioning, you can lose the audience. If you have a game that has a poor translation, where I cannot understand what to do next, it doesn't matter how great this game is, in the US, in the other regions, you just lost the customer because they don't know what to do. Very often, I deal with developers that say, oh, that is not important. That's misspelled. Oh, it's okay. It's just a button on that menu. It's going to take me, 5 minutes to fix? But it's 5 minutes that I would like to be doing something else. So I think you have to look into the perspective that you can either gain, a broader audience, or you can lose it immediately.
And maybe permanently.
Exactly.
So now, as you know, the games industry has definitely changed quite a bit. We're looking at a much faster paced environment with constant update. So in your opinion, these platforms say social, mobile, and web-based titles, right? So how does this trend impact the localization QA process, and also what kind of challenges are you guys going through or seeing right now?
Well, I can hit that first. So I've had several experiences with fairly large-scale localization in very different software development models. One of which was at a very large company doing long-term software product development, where software was being put onto handsets, and not done in a waterfall model, but almost, and where all of the localization was done up front before ship. So the synchronization of all the localization work had to be complete. QA of the entire product, including all of the languages, had to be complete up front. And then on the other hand, I've had experiences with several MMOs and work on browser-based games in which we've been doing updates, from anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks apart, doing new deployments. And the one thing that certainly was made clear is that you have to have a process in place that allows the software development teams, art and other teams, to work in parallel with localization. Localization can't be the bottleneck. Everything else about the entire workflow has to be able to proceed apace, and you also have to build it into the system at the beginning that you're going to expect to have that kind of iteration, and you're going to expect to have correction. It can't be based on thinking that there's going to be a perfect production. So.
Yeah, sorry, I want to add one more point to the previous question, which I should have mentioned. So regarding localization, so Windows 8 we've announced already, so I can share. We're going into 109 languages across 231 markets.
Wow.
And so part of that isn't just, like I said, to make money. The larger reason is also to show the support that we're doing for the regions and the different languages. Some of these languages I can't mention because it's not public yet, but some of them are actually dying languages. And so we want to show our support as a company that we're helping to maintain that. So with Windows and whatever other products, we're going to help support that. So going to the current question, I completely agree. And for me, the key word is the fundamentals of your project and your process technology have to be all defined. So making sure you have the right expectation with your developer team and with your localization team, whether it's what's your source repository system, can I check in, if I check in, check out, after I check in, what's the time to expect the next build that my localized content will be in. You also want to make sure the game or the platform is globalized, so that means it's ready for almost any target language. Once it's globalized, you could add, say, Chinese or Korean later. If you already have Japanese support, you can add Chinese or Korean later and reasonably confident that it's going to work. The last point I would say is, from my perspective, we really need to have strong vendor partners. And why this is because we end up relying a lot more on these vendor partners. So for the last 6 months, I've been trying to manage 20 projects, and without the strong vendor partners I have, it would be impossible. So especially as we go up more with these quicker turnaround, I truly have to rely on the partners.
I would add that finding resources, the proper resources are the key to a successful, localization implementation. Just think that you can use Google Translation to whatever language you want. That doesn't work. And I have, unfortunately, a lot of developers that said, oh yes, we did, we translated, here's the content. And you start reading like, who translated? Oh, I use Google Translate. Why? So that is very important, to have a process in place and make sure that the implementation is, done correctly from the get-go, because you're looking at cost. You want to make money, but you don't want to spend money. So you got to a point where you need to know how to balance that and be efficient. So have all the stakeholders on your, of the process, involved in the process, understand how to do it and agree and follow up. Right? It's not just yes, 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 and then when it gets to the point where you're going to execute, it's just a madhouse. Prioritize the languages that you want to do it. Sometimes you don't have, especially like for small developers and publishers, you don't have all the money to do everything at once that you want. So have all that established up front. I think that it makes easier to have a successful implementation.
Actually, I have another point I'd like to add to that. Kind of in terms of some of the underlying software architecture issues and platform issues. One of those is that it's certainly my experience over time that it's a best practice to just internationalize the software from the start. If you can go into development from the beginning, assuming it's going to be localized and do even English, as a version of localization, you'll be miles ahead. Rather than having the debt that you've incurred of having to go back and redress all of the baked-in art you might have or baked-in language text and fonts, my experience with that problem has ranged from C++ based apps with server-generated content, Flash apps, and HTML5 apps, and by far Flash was the most difficult, and HTML5 is the easiest in my experience. Another aspect of that is in kind of jumping off of your points is that there have certainly been some areas of product development I've worked in which we haven't had the opportunity to do all languages for all products at the same time. And when that's the case, it means for an online product, it means that it has to basically be built in throughout your system across your platform. Terms of things like online platform configuration and deployments, which parts of your product are available in which languages. And if you have to address issues like that, it becomes a much more complex problem. The fact that, for example, if somebody has if there's some form of lobbying scheme in your game and only certain games are available in certain markets, then that, having to deal with issues like that can, increase the complexity of doing localization tremendously. It also makes it very powerful because it unlocks your workflow to not having to have everything ready at the same time. But there is that added complexity.
Anything else to add?
English as just another language. So I'm actually happy to hear an engineering person say that. If you really treat English as just another language in your development cycle, once you start adding on French or German, it should just work for the most part. But having that mindset is very important. So you're my best friend now. It's very cool.
I thought I was already.
Right.
After my Blue Sea Sushi comment.
Yeah.
We cannot give up on the sushi, subject.
Well, no, I agree, and communication is definitely important as well, right, between the development team and the localization team. You don't want your localization team to be out of sync with your core product team as well. So what Valaji you comment on, kind of ties in with my next question as well. So on the software tool side, now some say the increased use of software tools would help and improve the localization process, which I'm talking about machine translation tools. So what has your experience been with these localization tools out there?
Bad.
The reason is?
Because it does not capture really the essence of the game itself, right? Or the content that you're translating, first of all. So I have instances where, like Konami is a Japanese company, so we have development teams in Japan where they initiate the game in Japanese, and then now I have to, to translate to English, and they use our team to actually go and, do all the translation for them. So how do you capture that? If I just go and translate, use, Google Translate to go from Japanese, which is very complex language, in my point of view, to English. If you don't understand what's going on in the game, and there is a plot in there, you totally lose, the essence of your franchise, of the titles that you're working on. So that to me is like having a human translator is essential. Not only have the human translation, but provide them more than just the text on the paper, right? Give them some kind of the prototype or the game so they understand what the game is, or the franchise they're working with. So they can, when the translation is being first, performed, it actually makes sense. So you can eliminate the back and forth, right? So that has been my experience.
So at Microsoft, we have a proprietary localization tool that we use. And one of the features that it has is called, we call it pseudo-localization. So it's fake localization. So an example would be, it would replace every letter E with an accent over it, or an R with like a backwards R from Cyrillic. So that's what we always use at the beginning of a project, just to test out the files, the UI, the build process, etc. So machine translation, one of my friends was the program manager for MS Research machine translation. So when I joined the games team, I was the most passionate to really use MT in our process, and I really tried, but I failed. It didn't work, right? Because the MT that exists currently is for, think of like productivity applications or SharePoint or something like that, right? That's where most of the corpus of information or data is available that MT engine uses. Well, I still did find a way to use MT though in production, which is, so I still do pseudo-localization, exchanging the letters, but I also use MT sometimes, say just German and Japanese for 1 or 2 off during pre-production. What that does is it's closer than pseudo-loc to a true translation, and it gives us more true positive layout issues, for example, in the build or the UI. So it doesn't work for production, but it can work. Yeah.
I agree with a lot of what they've both said, unfortunately, which you're not supposed to do in panels. But yeah, my experience with machine translation has been almost entirely negative, and actually the only positive benefit I've seen from it has been the fact that it exercises the UI in terms of layout. Otherwise, in terms of quality, it's generally been horrendous. It just doesn't, in my experience, hasn't been able to capture the cultural and contextual aspects of the game. There are many other aspects of automation in the workflow of incorporating localized content that are extremely valuable, and other use of tools. One thing that you mentioned, having a proprietary tool chain for localization. It's also been my experience that it's almost always been proprietary. There are very, very few tools I've seen that really address all of the problems because I think for many reasons, I think Partly because localization is tied into builds, and builds are often very kind of pragmatic aspect of software development, usually with lots of custom, pieces. Partly because it's tied into tools that artists and translators use, and they're not necessarily part of a normal software workflow. So, for example, in past work, I've had translators using spreadsheets for doing tables of translated elements, and then just having written tools to parse the contents of spreadsheets to pull those into CSV files, which get translated into, XML files that form string tables in our game. And there's nowhere in that workflow that translators would really find that process convenient, and you don't really want to put the burden on them to deal with those kinds of problems. So the collection of all that stuff winds up meaning a lot of glue code and lots of scripts and lots of various software tools to sort of enable that process.
Any tips for our audience in terms of some good ways to utilize this localization tools, or how you can optimize the localization process?
So you lost 5 points of friendship when you mentioned the spreadsheets. So please do not use spreadsheets if at all possible. The easiest way is to make a very simple XML file that has your English resources, and that way your translation vendors or your open source community, if that's what you want to use, can very quickly and easily translate it. So spreadsheets introduce, I'm from Microsoft, so it sounds weird, but they introduce a lot of unnecessary complexity, right? Whether it's a different version of the Excel file, or there's some actual Unicode issues with some languages in Excel as well. And the other thing is, if you have a single Excel file that has, whether it's just English or you expect all English plus French, Japanese, etc., this single file can only be managed by one translator, right? You can't have it being translated in parallel. So anytime I have a developer partner that I'm working with who says, oh yeah, here's our spreadsheet file, that we start over, and that's when the conversation from me starts and say, I can't work with this. So no spreadsheets, please.
We were actually requested to use spreadsheets in that project.
Not from me. So
Yeah, no,
it'll never happen.
it's true that we had significant issues in dealing with, actually particularly dealing with Excel, because a number of Microsoft products want to do things to your Unicode no matter what.
Yes.
For example, if you open a file with Notepad and there's anything in it that resembles a Unicode character set, then it will write it out as Unicode.
Right.
But yeah, so there are definitely issues around use of spreadsheets. So I'm not recommending spreadsheets in particular, but some tool that is acceptable and comfortable for the end user, who in this case are translators or artists.
I think also one thing that is helpful, especially like when you start the process, to build your own knowledge base, right? It will help in the long run on, especially if you're just dealing, let's say, with IFIGs, J, Portuguese, to have some of like the basic stuff already, in your knowledge base. So then it's, one word, one line that you just need to translate, and very simple, sometimes already there if you don't have the resource right there, at your fingertips.
Actually, one more point I will add, and I've run into this unfortunately. When you're developing your game, please make sure to have specific file sets for your releases. So if you have version 1, have one XML file for all the strings in version 1, and perhaps you have a separate file for common strings that go throughout your UI. But when you go to version 2, please use a separate file, because if you're using the same file, but you're working on version 2 while translators are still working, they don't know which strings are ready for translation, or, oh, these are just work in progress. And what's going to happen for you is you'll end up paying for translation that it's worthless, right? Because you're still updating the English, you're still prototyping. So try to have distinct sets of files for each release, please. Please.
We actually in the work that I did in that area in a previous position, we in the XML format that everything was compiled into, essentially, we had everything tagged with status codes that had to do with, that reflected the fact that either it was a translated element that had been accepted, So basically, status codes that reflect the QA processing of that localizable element. So whether it was translated and accepted, whether it needed to be retranslated because somebody had seen it and realized like, no, that's not what that means, or that's not the sense of what we're trying to get with that, or something missing and needing to be translated. And we also did have a mechanism for incorporating versioning fragments of localizable stuff because of the fact that we were constantly importing new content. So there's always a base of stuff, and there's always new content going out, being translated, and being pulled into upcoming releases or upcoming deployments. And so that is pretty critical. Another part of that was very important was some of the basic mechanics in terms of incorporating localizable content into builds to be able to automate as much of that as possible, just to be able to hone in on mistakes. So things like something which was actually fairly difficult to do in Flash, being able to detect that a localized string with a font embedding spills out of its UI element, like exceeds the area that it's been given in the UI. Just even basic things like that. Being able to quickly go through with the tool and detect unlocalized pieces. Because if you put the burden on QA to have to go through every single screen of the UI, to make sure that you haven't missed anything, obviously that's significantly more labor involved. And so just everything that you can do to automate that part of the process helps.
Any other additional feedback before I jump on to a different topic?
I could go on and on about
Yeah.
this. You're giving other ideas. Yeah. So say you have your XML file, right? Very simple schema.
He's very passionate about the XML file. Can you feel
Yeah.
it?
The more metadata you can give about each string, the better, right? So whether it's contextual info or, as Jeff mentioned, like if you have a maximum number of characters you already know, that's going to help your translator to say, okay, I'll have to make sure it fits within 12 characters, for example. Another thing is if you have a full string and within that string you have your product name that you're not going to translate, make sure you highlight, do not translate this product name, right? There are a lot of pieces of metadata that you can add for your translators or your partners that's going to make a lot easier. And what you mentioned about parts not being translated, it goes back to, again, making sure English is just another language. From the beginning, maybe very initial prototype, you can have everything hard-coded, right, your strings. After that, oh yeah, ideally no, but I'm being realistic, right? So if possible, no. But if you, as soon as you can get them out, the English strings out and resource into a file, then you'll already be ensuring that every translatable string resource is already in the separate XML file. And it makes things a lot easier as you go forward. So I'll stop there, or we won't end.
No, feel free to add on.
That's okay.
Do you have additional comments?
And provide all the information to the people that actually do the QA and go in, and test, especially like verify the in-game text, everything and how it's supposed to be, because sometimes there's this, break of communication between the people implementing, translating, and then the ones that are going to do the verification, right? So having all the information to QA is great.
Yes. All this goes without saying that you're doing everything in UTF-8 to begin with, or possibly Unicode 16, but
Yes.
Very good. Now let's jump on to the vendor management side. So I've come to learn that it's important to find a partner who cares as much as you do about localizing your product into different languages and also testing through it. And obviously on the quality side, it's definitely important. So do you believe the following practices are important to your partnership with your vendors? First, let's talk about strategic drivers. Would you share those drivers with your vendors when it comes to a quicker turnaround, greater cost reduction, consistent high quality of work? How would you weigh on them?
I think just as you said, you not only have to find a vendor, but the vendor has to become your partner. Meaning, they have to understand your product. They have to understand your process and work, even though you are two separate entities, you work as one, right? It has to have that synergy. Otherwise, it does not work. And when you're looking for the vendor, to me, what's important, that they do understand what they're doing, right? It's not just like, oh, how much it costs. It's a little more, into that. I have vendors that will approach me and say, oh, it's $10 an hour, but that $10 an hour, it will end up costing me, $100 an hour because of the back and forth that it's gonna go through, and the translations and implementation verification is not done, properly because they do not understand the content and how the company works. So that to me is extremely important.
So I would say, yes, it's important to share those to the extent that, partly it defines the contractual relationship, and partly that informs them in terms of how to resource the project and how to do the planning that they need to do. Around issues like turnaround, in my world, it's kind of just a given that you have to have fast turnaround almost no matter how much planning you do. Obviously, sometimes needing fast turnaround is a result of bad planning. But from the standpoint of a localization vendor, I think to them, what we do would almost inevitably be considered very fast turnaround. I've had previous experiences on projects where we gave them content that we expected to get back 3 to 4 weeks later or something, and that would certainly generally never fly in what I'm doing now. But even with that, it's very important to be able to work within their schedules, and obviously that requires giving them some look ahead about what the main drivers are for you. We're in an environment where it's not that cost is unimportant, but turnaround is much faster to us than cost, for example, in what I'm doing.
Yeah, I completely agree with the partnership. When I'm working with my vendor partners, they truly are partners. And sharing the strategic drivers allows the partner, our vendor partners are basically our solution providers, right? So I can come up with ideas on what I think might work, but when I go to my vendor partners, they're the ones who help me innovate, right? They say, this is what we can do, or why don't we try this? And that allows me to bring that to my team and say, here's what we can do. So it makes me look good as well. So sharing, to a certain extent, the strategic drivers, yes, is important.
Some of this in terms of how much of a partnership they are willing to participate in can be very important depending on the nature of what you're developing. If it were, say, kind of standard forms-based web application or something, probably many of its elements could be just translated based on the basic definition of the thing, the wireframe or the information layout. But if it's something like an MMO, where there's a huge amount of contextual information and story about the content, they really have to learn it. I mean, there may even be a whole additional layer of grammatical understanding that's needed. So, for example, in some of the past work in my experience, it actually wasn't just single string translation. There's a system of substitutable values, in grammatical elements where, person and gender in the string can change and quantities can change depending on the content of the game story and the content of whatever's being presented. And so that's a whole different level of understanding for a localizing vendor to have to take on. And you have to find somebody who's willing to do that, who doesn't want to just be kind of thrown a spreadsheet or an XML file full of data.
So for those who aren't working with the localization vendor just yet, I want to make sure, as you look, you make sure to concentrate on game localization vendors, not just any localization vendor, because we're creating, whether it's something realistic like a racing game or like a fantasy world, right? And so the translation resources that those vendor partners have versus standard localization vendors are completely different. Add on to that, you remember you have to go through certification for different platforms. Well, games loc vendors understand that and understand the requirements, the priority. If it's a standard localization vendor, we'll get it. And then in the end, you're like, oh, sorry. So just make sure you do that.
Yes, especially when you're talking about the compliance side, when they decide to, let me change this doesn't sound good, and you just fail at, one of the TRCs or TCRs, like, why? Because they don't have that kind of experience. So it's important for you to, to have the understanding and really investigate their experience, know your product and know how to shop for it, if it's for mobile, if it's game, if it's, web development, what exactly you're targeting for. It's not one size fits all.
That's a very good point when it comes to terminologies. How about setting measurable objectives and metrics and localization? How do you go about measuring performance and success?
I usually measure it by the different languages like that we have, and bugs is your best tool in my case. How many bugs on X, Y, and Z language, and the title that you're working on, especially if you have 2-3 different iterations of that game where it's kind of failing it. So that's really what I use, as far as metric goes.
Yeah, but bug count and
Bugs,
also
bugs.
did we ship on time? That's critical. And all the projects that I work on are always simultaneous ship. We call sim ship. So English and all languages are released at the same time. So for me, that's the priority. The language quality, definitely, right? The UI quality, is the voiceover good, and is it in there, the timing, everything. But in the end, did we ship on time, right? And during production there might be some communication challenges or timing issues, but if you look at the project overall and it went well, for me that's the success meter.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. It may vary for different people's business climates or your target market, but for us, again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, definitely hitting the schedule, having the turnaround that we needed, hitting the schedule is kind of the most important criteria. The other thing is, going back to the comments I made earlier about tools, is if you have some of the aspects of the QA workflow represented in tools, it can be kind of, the metrics clearly fall out of that because you have a number of missed items or a number of items needing retranslation later as a pretty clear indicator of sort of how good a job you're doing and they're doing in that process.
I think that's also, making sure that you have postmortems with your team and also with the vendors, with your partner, to identify, where things did not go right, where things went, so the next time around you can make sure that those are the first items to be, tackled. So always improving. Kaizen.
Oh, very good. Yes, Kaizen, always improving. But Ichiro's leaving Seattle, so it's kind of... it's true, postmortems are very important. The funny thing is, when I work with my vendor partners, I always have to stress to them, tell me the truth, because I need to know what didn't work from my side too, right? It's not a finger-pointing game, it's a learning experience, right? We've been through production for this project together, what went well, what didn't, and let me know so I can continue the good stuff and stop the bad stuff. So yeah, postmortems are very, just like in your internal teams, I'm sure you already do it, right? It's very important to take some time right after you ship, after the launch parties, then take some time and discuss.
I would add to that I absolutely agree that postmortems are critically important, as with most other aspects of software development. But in addition to that, one of the other benefits of globalizing your software to begin with is that actually you can do the first phase or the first version of your software, for example, in English, as kind of a dry run of the whole localization process with a vendor. And by doing that, then you'll have a version that, one, has exercised all of the tools that you have, and possibly illuminated the gaps that you have for other tools that you need or other changes you need to your process. And you've done it in such a way that everybody can see the results and everybody that you have on staff can evaluate. Because if you do it in English, then you have everybody already available, assuming you're an English-speaking company. You have everybody already available to review the results. So if you wait to get to the point where you have, where you're dealing with all of these things for the first time in another language, then you're much more dependent upon the vendor and the other aspects of the process to be able to flag problems they're not nearly so obvious. Whereas if you do it at the first stage for your first language in English, then it's a pretty easy way to call out, you know, problems that you have.
Yeah, and I mentioned pseudo-localization. So I think it's still online. There's source code on Codeplex to do your own pseudo-localization. So there's some source code or just a library that you can implement, and it'll do the change the E to E with accent or whatever. And that's exactly, you know, it allows you to test, make sure your product is globalized much early in the cycle. Yeah.
Yeah, an example of some custom tools that I think often wind up being needed. I wasn't aware of that or hadn't found anything like that in a previous project, which was a Flash-based, browser-based MMO. We wrote something that spiders through the entire app, finding all the text objects within Flash and doing that to them.
That makes
essentially
sense,
pseudo-localizing all of the English text elements.
Nice.
We also had things that, for example, UI elements are originally defined with just a string key label, like an all caps label that was like str underscore, you know, battle underscore something. And we'd write a tool that detects all of the examples or all the occurrences of that in the binary. And so after translation, if there are any of those things remaining, then something was missed. So that's an example of the kinds of sort of automated processes you can apply to that.
Nice.
One last point. So would you share your long-term plan with your vendor?
Absolutely. I mean, to the extent possible, for sure. I know I've had personal experience with having not done that and then having gotten burned by having a vendor drop out in the middle of essentially in the middle of a project. So
I don't even know it most of the time, so the projects I manage are always on the new platforms. So I know the overall strategy, but the actual projects that are coming down, it change. I tell my partners this: I come in on Monday and there's 5 new projects, and by Friday there's only 2 left, right? So I don't even know it.
Ditto.
not doing it.
I can share as much as I know.
Sure. Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And it changes constantly, unfortunately. So if I have the information, yes, but if I don't, and that's one of the first things, you know, that I share, like the conversation starts, so what's the schedule? I don't have the whole information right now, you know, and how many languages. Sometimes you don't have, like, you think that you're going eFigs, and then suddenly they drop 1 or they add 5, you know what I mean? It's a constant change, so.
Certainly the disclaimer that, yes, to the extent that you know your plans, and in my current environment, you know, our product roadmap can change every 3 weeks. But one of the reasons that I found that important is that I've worked for a number of small game development companies and not large publishers. And as part of working for a small company, if you are working with localization vendors, you know, if you expect them to make that investment in your project, like some of the things that we've talked about, it's hard to get them to do that if they kind of don't see the future and don't know, you know, what's ahead for them. Probably if you are a Konami or a Microsoft and you're going to have the localization vendor, you know, on staff one way or another for the foreseeable future, maybe that part of it's not as essential. I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, like you said, they need to know what to invest in as well, right? So it's as much as we can share, we do, or I do, but yeah, I don't get that. Yeah.
It's good to have, but you know, we do understand the situation too, right? But it's good to have only because that we can build out the right kind of approach to support our clients' long-term growth as well. So, so one last question. So what are the 2 most important criteria, you say, to achieve successful localization QA?
Have a process in place. You know, make sure that you have the buy-in of everyone on the team, from, you know, the developer to production, so how that process is going to, you know, the flow of that process. And make sure that it's not just, yeah, we agree, but we don't follow. We agree and we follow. So that is critical. Also, if you're going to depend in having to not only have your in-house team, but you need to find a vendor that is your partner, that understands all the, challenge that you're going through inside of the organization, so they will be available for you. That's part of the partnership. That they're not just gonna say, oh, today I don't have the team for you, and you're sitting there like, I need this yesterday. So those are important things. And on the vendor side, that they actually have qualified, resources to provide not only your translation, but, proofreading and testing of your title if, all that is needed.
So you'll like this. So I completely would agree on the mutual expectations, but one of the top two for me is flexibility. So you need to make sure everything is defined and you understand, but you still need to be flexible,
Yes.
because
Sure.
in the end, right, that things change or you have to do whatever, right? And the other thing for me related to this is having a good relationship with your partner. So for me, it's developer partners, whether internal or external, and that, if they say there's no way we can do that anymore, we have to change this, then okay, fine. I still push back, but if we have to, we have to, right? So for me, those are the two big points.
I also had process and tools. If you had to pick, I'd say process is more important, but tools are pretty critical. As with other aspects of software, finding bugs later is much more expensive than preventing bugs earlier in the pipeline, and that applies to localization as well. So in the process of developing tools and defining a process, anything you can do that's going to make the whole system, the whole ship more airtight, is going to pay off in the long run. And anything that you can do with tools to both make people's time more efficient and also, reduce errors is going to pay off, hugely in the long run.
Any additional comments for our audience before we wrap up?
XML file. Please.
Green curry hamburger.
Great. I think we can take a couple questions, or do we have the time?
Yeah, actually, I have something,
Oh, great. Okay.
if you don't mind.
No problem.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sherry Rubin. I was one of the founders with Ben and others here for the QA SIG for the IGDA. And I worked with Ben a little bit to help get this going, to get this track. For those of you that were here last year, you realize that that was the first ever QA track at an industry conference anywhere for video games, which was a huge achievement for us. Some of us have spent over 5 years trying to make that happen. But there's one person in particular who was crucial and critical and got that done last year, and again took on the reins this year and helped organize all of our amazing panels and speakers, and is emceeing the track today. So I'd like to call Ben Wibberley, if he doesn't mind. And I'm going to embarrass him. So he doesn't know this, but the rest of the steering committee members and I of the QA SIG agreed to present Ben here with a little award of excellence for his dedication to the craft of quality assurance. We would not be getting this recognition as a discipline if it wasn't for Ben. And so I just wanted everybody here to acknowledge that and say thank you, Ben, and I really appreciate everything that you've done for the QA craft and for the QA SIG in general. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome. He's almost gonna cry, yay. So I didn't mean to interrupt the panel, but I wanted to make sure we did it while we were here and around everybody. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to say thank you very much to the localization panel. Give them a round of applause. Thank you. Right, now I'm very embarrassed, so I'll see you after lunch. Come back after lunch, we have some great sessions.